So we're recording, good. It is my pleasure to introduce James O'Dwyer today, who's going to be talking to us about how to be stable. And without further ado, I will turn the word to him now.
Thank you, Yuri, and thanks to all of the organizers for inviting me to give this seminar. It's terrific. It's one of the maybe relatively few silver linings of the past year or so, but being able to give seminars via Zoom, I think, has really opened things up. So it's really nice to be able to see everyone here. Lots of names I recognize and lots that I don't, but thanks for having me, and it's great to be here and give this talk. So I'm going to talk about stability, not only stability in today's talk. I'll give you some vignettes of other projects related to this, but stability is going to be the thing I spend most time talking about. And so just to put us on the same page, I'm thinking about networks of populations interacting in some way, represented by the links between these populations. And stability here is just the classical concept of local stability. So I'm thinking about what happens when I perturb this system. One population gets a bit bigger or a bit smaller. Does that eventually come back to where you started? Maybe it has some big excursions along the way, or maybe not, but does it come back to where you started, or does it diverge and take you to some totally different equilibrium? So it's a very basic concept. I suppose you would say it's important because to the extent equilibrium is even relevant in natural systems, if you're near an equilibrium and it's unstable, well, surely you're going to experience perturbations. So really an unstable equilibrium is something that you're unlikely to see or to be near, I suppose, in a natural system. So having a stable equilibrium is at least giving some insight into what kinds of equilibria you might expect to see. So it's a basic question. It also links ecology to other fields, and some of the results I'm going to talk about have been leveraged in a variety of complex systems, including financial systems, human social interactions, etc. And so it's a basic concept, and I think it links ecology to different fields. It gives, it's common language that many people in different areas can understand and talk about. Okay, so what makes an equilibrium arising from a network of interactions like that stable? Well, first of all, you have to have a language to describe the dynamics of a community like that. And so some of the classic work on this in some beautiful papers in the 20s and 30s described a framework for modeling those interactions. So usually known as the Lotka-Volterra equations, or a couple of different variations on that. They allow for a range of different types of interactions with different signs, and quantify a simple way to describe the dynamics of multiple species interacting. So what do we have here? Well, I should say, first of all, before talking about the interactions, both species here have a growth rate. So this would drive the dynamics primarily when both species are rare. And then each species has some kind of self-limitation. So you might imagine if each species were in isolation and just limited by space, the dynamics would be driven ultimately by the alpha-1,1 and alpha-2,2 coefficients. And then the interactions, I guess you could say the interesting part. This is how each species limits the growth of each other species. Just two species here, but the generalization of this would be a matrix of interaction coefficients, parameters in these ordinary differential equations. So from this perspective, the network over here, and I'm drawing different arrows in each direction here just because the interactions don't necessarily have to be symmetric. So just to make it a bit more complicated, I'm allowing for that in the picture as well as in the matrix. So in this picture, this community and its outcomes in terms of stability, or really whatever else you want to ask about the community, is more or less governed by this matrix over here. Okay, so what is it that makes that, well, if there is an equilibrium, what is it that makes that equilibrium stable? So, well, maybe just taking a step back, of course, you could just say, well, I've got a matrix. The stability criteria are going to depend on the spectrum of eigenvalues of this matrix. Fine. So in a sense, that's the end of the story, right? You have set of all possible matrices with positive numbers for their entries. You could just simply say, well, it's all of those matrices that have some set of properties for their spectrum. That will be it. But it's not really very intuitive. It doesn't really lend itself to a comprehensive description of what types of matrices, that you could say in words lead to stable equilibria. And so I'd say that a huge amount of progress was made on that 50 years or so ago, and many papers since then. And the idea is to say, well, we can get some grasp of a simpler description of which community matrices will lead to stable equilibria by randomly rewiring where those interactions are, who is linked to whom in that network. And so you could think about this as repeatedly drawing from a probability distribution where the interactions are among a set of species and how strong they are as well, and what sign they have, potentially too. So this is trying to get to a simple description of what types of matrix lead to stable equilibria, because you just have number of species, number of interactions or connectants, and then the strength of interactions. And actually, before I came to Illinois, I didn't really know about this part of the history. I knew of Bob May's paper, but he cites this earlier paper, which was actually from a group at Illinois in what we called at the time the Biological Computing Lab. And so this, the BCL was active in the 50s through the 70s, and quite a lot of cool stuff, really early connections of biological questions with computation. So this is a paper coming out of that lab, Gardner and Ashby, and it's looking at precisely this question. So you're randomly rewiring those networks and looking at what the fraction is of the outcomes you get. So you randomly rewire the network many times, and you look at the fraction of times you end up with a stable equilibrium. And so when there are no interactions up here, so no interactions on the x-axis, you have 100% of the time a stable equilibrium. As you start to increase the number of interactions, all of these curves drop down to 0 eventually, and the 3 different curves represent different numbers of species, so 4, 7, and 10. And the other thing you might note is that the steepness of the transition and also how early the transition occurs both change with numbers of species. So basically, the equilibrium in these random communities is unstable if there are too many taxa, too many interactions, or it turns out interactions are too strong, typical interaction strength too strong. And so Bob May put these parameters together and quantified how strong is too strong, and the constant setting this is related to the intraspecific interactions, the self-limitation I mentioned earlier. So it's a beautiful result, which many people here will be familiar with, but it's, if you're not, beautiful result to dig into, just an amazing way to link these very basic properties of a community matrix to stability. So, well, what does it tell us? It tells us something kind of counterintuitive, and that is we shouldn't expect to see large, complex, strongly interacting communities in natural systems, at least if you buy the logic I gave you at the beginning, that we're unlikely to see unstable equilibria. They should really be perturbed away from that very quickly, and we'd reach some new equilibrium, probably with fewer species or fewer interactions or something like this. But there's a whole story there about the evolution of those networks over time, but I'm not going to get into that. Anyway, it's a bit counterintuitive because we look around and seemingly see strongly interacting ecological communities. And so Bob May, I think not in that paper, but in a subsequent paper, noted that there must be some devious strategies which make for stability in natural systems. So In other words, there's just some way in which these Lotka-Volterra interactions are quite atypical of one of those random draws, and that's the way to avoid instability, which is fine. You know, not an illogical way to approach this question. With Stacey Butler, who was a student and then a postdoc in our lab and is now working in industry, we thought about a different, also long-standing perspective on thinking about community interactions. And it goes back really all the way to those early Lotka-Volterra papers, where if you look through them, they're littered with quotes about, say, what competition is for, or what is leading to interaction coefficients in Lotka-Volterra equations. And so if it's competition, it may well be competition for resources. And then quantifying that, consumer resource dynamics goes back a long way as well. So what we wanted to get at was, what are the stability criteria for arbitrarily large systems of species that are not only consuming resources, but also producing resources as well? I should say the basic consumer resource picture does go back a really long way to the 60s and 70s, but in the last few years, there's several research groups trying to quantify, I guess, various properties of large, arbitrarily interacting communities where there are both positive and negative interactions. So let me just kind of draw the picture of what this looks like. So I'll take my network from earlier, or actually a random rewiring of that network, and just zoom in on the interaction between two of these species. So suppose this is a competitive interaction. The logic I've just gone through is that, well, that certainly could be simply competition for food. You know, maybe it's food distributed throughout a landscape, a spatial landscape. We both consume the same food, and therefore, the more I consume of it, there'll be some net negative effect on your growth rate. So that's one part of this picture. Just to mention, the other part here is that I have food that's flowing in here from the outside. So this is an open system. One of the, I guess, vignettes I could have included, but I think I'll probably run out of time anyway, is what happens if this is a closed system without any input from outside. And that is also quite an interesting story. But it's open, so there can be flow in of food from outside. Could also be production of food. So we may return food to the common pool, either through excreting resources or by dying, and there's then recycling of cells, which may release some usable resources for others, or maybe just terminal unusable resources for anyone who's around, but it could be either. The community part up here, right? I've got two species, but I had this whole network. That was already, if you like, complex, heterogeneous, many different taxa with different properties. The resource landscape can be quite complex as well. So instead of just food, there might be different types of food. And for example, if there are subs around, Robin and I might compete for the subs, but maybe if it's just bagels and cookies, we don't compete because we each have a preference only for one of those. So there can be different preferences and needs for essential resources among resource types. And of course, what you put back into the common pool, these arrows here going down to the resources, that can also vary by resource type. So that's the kind of conceptual picture. Here's a deterministic differential equation, description of the same thing. So I've got the resource inflow here for resource R alpha. So this is the dynamics of the resources down here, the dynamics of the consumers who can also produce resources. This particular framing of consumer resource dynamics has a set of substitutable, potentially substitutable resources. I could eat any of those, bagel, sub, or cookie. Maybe I have different preferences for them, but they can all serve the same purpose for me. And so C alpha I here would be the depletion rate of a particular resource alpha by consumer I. And that's a matrix and could look like whatever it looks like. We don't know yet. Production of resources here. Again, there's some characteristic production of resources by consumer I. It could also depend on what resources are out there and what resources the consumer is currently consuming. I'll come back to that in a moment. And there could be outflow or degradation of resources over time. Consumer equations somewhat parallel this. This first term, I've written in a more complex way to reflect the fact that consumers may not deplete resources in proportion to the benefit they gain from them. So if you wanted to be simplistic about it, I might know what resources you need. I go and kind of screw those up or trash them somehow, but I didn't get any benefit from those. However, that could give me a competitive advantage over you if I destroy all the resources you need and I still have whatever I need and I can go out and find that. So that's characterized by this additional matrix down here, epsilon alpha I. Correspondingly, I'm balancing biomass here. So whatever is taken out of whatever is put into the resource pile is taken out of the biomass pile. So these terms come with opposite signs. And there could be mortality or outflow of individuals from the populations of each species. This mu I mean, it could be very closely related to the outflow up here. If it was a chemostat, you'd probably expect these to be equal if you have the right units for everyone. It could be that there's some other source of mortality for the consumers. I think we're always in ecology drawing a box around the system somewhere and excluding something. So mu I could capture a lot of that additional external influence on mortality. So what I did with Stacy, we worked on a couple of projects. This is not the extent of it, but I'm giving you one of the cases we looked at. We simplified this picture. First of all, I will note that over here, this epsilon matrix disappeared or just became a single number. So I am in this model having depletion of resources proportional to the benefits that consumers gain from depleting the resources. And I also made production just a matrix. So there's no R dependence here anymore, which you could interpret in a couple of ways. Either the metabolic pathways you use to process resources have the same endpoints, the same waste products, no matter what you take in. Could be true in some cases and not true in others. Or you could think about it sort of not totally dissimilarly as a recycling term. What happens when I die to whatever the component parts were in my cell or my body, that could be captured by this kind of term here. And in fact, you can see that both the mortality term and this term functionally look identical in terms of what they do in the consumer equation. It's just something proportional to Ni multiplied by a number. Here it's just like row sums of this matrix that provides the number. And so really the only difference is you could think about this term here as leading to terminal resources that are lost to the system altogether. This dumps resources back into the common pool. And so that's the difference. So you could think about it as recycling. This simplification I made over here with Theo Gibbs, who's a grad student at Princeton now, and I'll talk about another collaboration involving Theo. He was here as a research assistant in the lab. We're looking at some generalizations of this to allow for the relaxation of this assumption. So there's some quite interesting results there too, but I'm not going to talk about those today. So basically, this system is defined by two matrices and the resource inflow rates. So it's the matrix of consumption preferences. So imagine basically you're limited by one qualitative type of resource, say carbon limited, and then these are different forms of carbon. You can use any of them potentially, but you have different preferences for them. And over here is what you put back into the common pool. I'm not going to go through the derivations of the results because there are quite a lot of results, different types of model, not necessarily just those substitutable resources. So a lot of breadth, if you like, to these results. At the same time, we start to make many assumptions too. So dig into the papers if you're interested in the details. But I'll give you a flavor of the two main outcomes that we proved. One is when resource inflow is small, most networks of positive interactions will lead to an unstable. If there is a positive equilibrium, it will be unstable. So that's kind of striking. Second is that some networks avoid that instability for all resource inflows. So they're always stable. And being even close to those networks, so these are special networks, if you like, you don't have to be totally fine-tuned to avoid instability, because even being close to them means the system can survive stable down to maybe a smaller level of resource inflow than if you're far from these special networks. So we have a characterization of these networks in terms of properties of the matrix P and C in some cases. I guess, is quite a neat mathematical characterization of what the stability criteria are. I would also really like to have a more comprehensive picture of translating that, if you like, into the a bit like the Bob May result, which really captures what those random matrix stability criteria look like in terms of really simple properties of the matrices. I'd like to be able to do a bit better with that here. I can pick out special cases. So for example, reciprocal exchange, where I provide as much of the resource that you need as you provide of the resource or resources that I need. That's one of these special network structures. But there are others too, which satisfy the criteria that we laid out in these papers. So just to give you a picture visually of what that looks like, here is a randomly drawn exchange network, all positive entries, but according to some probability distribution. Over here, I'm plotting in each pair of panels up and down, it's consumers and resources. So these pairs are stuck together. These are the same simulation in each case. Across the panels, left to right, I'm increasing resource inflow. And then it's just time on the x-axis in each case. And you can see that eyeballing it, I mean, I'm not saying this is the proof of what I just stated, but eyeballing it, you can see that you're at stable equilibrium here. You know, we start from some perturbed initial condition and go back to this equilibrium. But as you move down to the left-hand side with limited resource inflow, you have some very complicated limit cycle, which I don't know how to characterize, but you lose that stability. The same picture, if you were to symmetrize this matrix to one of those special cases where this matrix was characterizing reciprocal exchange, you're stable all the way down. So revisiting those two takeaways, a couple of interesting points relative to the Lotka-Volterra systems. What you might have thought before was a stable network can become unstable when resource inflow changes. So you have an additional knob to tune because you have this additional layer of description of what's driving the interactions. And as you tune that knob, or as nature tunes it for you, you may destabilize what you would think of as a stable network. And the other side of it would be that large, diverse, strongly interacting communities can be stable given the right combination of network structure and resource inflow rates. Okay, so that's sort of the main set of results. And I know I'm not supposed to be talking for too long. I wanted to give you a flavor of 3 other projects. The only one I'm going to talk about in any length is the first of these. And that's sort of where these consumer resource dynamics come from or came from. And then if I do run out of time, I have to skip over the last 2 projects, but they're really interesting generalizations building on some of these insights from the first few papers with Stacy. So if you like, in that previous set of projects, we just guessed, I guess I should say, we really drew from the literature what other people had deduced were quite plausible functional forms for production and consumption, particularly for the consumption part, that model of substitutable resources. And for the production part, we did pretty much guess that kind of recycling form was reasonable. So where do those functional forms really come from? And are they inevitable? Are they the only functional forms you might see or think are reasonable? So this is work with Mario Mascarella. Mario has started his own lab at the University of Alaska. He's beginning to warm up there at this point. And we basically are asking, why do these equations look like this? Or what should they look like? And thinking about it in terms of a bigger picture, many of you may work on or collaborate with people who think about really detailed models of internal metabolism, and they may go by the name genome scale models, and flux balance analysis usually comes into play as part of it. And at the other end, I guess I would call what I've shown you as something more like traditional consumer resource models. So I'm not sure if this is really a spectrum truly, but in any case, they're sort of different extreme ways of modeling communities involving resources and consumers. And over here at this end, if you're not familiar with it, there are some really cool papers which for small communities of fairly well characterized microbes can make interesting predictions about, say, relative abundances. It's harder for larger communities to make these predictions, and it's inevitably going to be harder the less you know about the metabolism of the taxa. But it's quite cool stuff. So we want to do something in the middle. If you buy that this is a spectrum, we want it to be sort of in the middle, and go down one level further, if you like, in terms of the degree of description, or the level of description of these dynamics. So going from Lotka-Volterra to the consumer resource dynamics, at this point, we want to dip our toes into the intracellular processes that give rise to those population and community dynamics. So here is a simple model of fermentation. Two resources are essential for that process going in. Well, more than two, but we're simplifying it to two resources, glucose and phosphate. They're taken up by a cell at some rate. They can be excreted or lost by the cell at some other rate, nu1 and nu2, uptake rates K1 and K2. The N1 here represents how many cells there are in total. And then internally, something happens. There's a reaction. M1 and M2 are the internal concentrations of these two resources. R1 and R2 are the external concentrations outside the cell. And then there's a parameter describing that interaction rate. That produces new cells, new biomass, and also may, and in general will, produce byproducts. In this case, lactate would be the byproduct. So stuff goes in, it can leak out as well as go in. If it's in there, there's a rate of reaction, which is basically assuming, not unlike Lotka-Volterra models, I suppose, that these molecules are just bouncing around inside the cell, and when they get close enough, there's a reaction. You could refine that, obviously. And if there is a reaction, at some rate, you produce new biomass and a byproduct. So it is capturing, what I said was what we wanted to capture in those earlier models, but it's a bit more of a fine-grained description. And so if people are familiar with it, it's a bit like the Droop model, which Droop wrote about in multiple papers in the 70s. In that model, the assumption is that the production of biomass and hence population growth of this species depends on the internal concentration of a single resource, which is assumed to be limiting. So it's a bit like that, but now we have this interaction between the two resources that are inside the cell, and it's limited, if you like, by both internally. So we assumed an internal balance of fluxes. So really the flux balance analysis that is used in those much more complicated genome scale models. And so I'm assuming that these internal concentrations, M1 and M2, are at an equilibrium, and then I'm balancing these fluxes. You need a couple more assumptions here to make progress. So we assumed that the leakage process was essentially kind of passive, so that the leakage rate would be proportional to how much you got in there. So basically, the cell like a balloon that's leaky, and if you fill it up too much, stuff leaks out. And that's this term here. So putting it all together, you get something that looks a bit horrendous, but it's not too bad. It's just the equilibrium concentrations for these metabolites inside the cell. So they're in there, they're constantly taken up, they're potentially reacting with each other in the cell. Put all that together, take it to equilibrium. This is what you get, where this function f just combines multiple of these parameters, so uptake rates, leakage rates, and the reaction rates inside the cell. All right, so let me give you some takeaways why that is interesting, why I think it is interesting. So fine, we've got the equilibrium concentrations of the internal metabolites, the internal resource concentrations. That immediately gives you what the production rate for biomass is. It's going to be proportional to this parameter beta, the reaction rate multiplied by those equilibrium concentrations. So that gives you, depending on all those parameters, including the external resource concentrations, it gives you an expression for the population growth rate. This growth rate is going to depend on all of those parameters above, the resources outside. I'll also tack on the possibility of just the cells themselves dying. So that's the same process we had before. That could come from anything else that takes these cells out of the system altogether. At the end of it all, and again, you can check into the paper for what exactly these look like, you get a set of pretty complicated looking differential equations for the population size and the concentrations of all three resources. So I'm going to home in on a couple of interesting outcomes. So the ODEs look kind of complicated, but you can take certain limits of those. And so one limit is when the reaction rate beta is much larger, basically, than the leakage rates inside the cell. And in that case, the population dynamics reduce to something like this. So I'm assuming you could really replace these two terms with K1 and K2. I'm just assuming that the uptake rates of these resources are proportional to R1 and R2, but you could put it in any functional form you like, some kind of Monod form or saturating form or whatever you think is best. But the upshot is that the population growth rate depends on the current number of cells and then the minimum of the two uptake rates. So this is well known, it's Liebig's law of the minimum. And it's an outcome of one limit of this model. You can also look at when the reaction rate is very small compared to the other rates. And that gives you a different limit of the ODEs, and the population growth looks different. So now it's still proportional to the current number of cells. Mortality is just along for the ride, that doesn't really change. But now you depend on both uptake rates multiplied together. Or if you take my simplified form for these uptake rates, you depend on the product of the external densities of the two resources, R1 and R2. And it sort of makes intuitive sense. Basically, this is saying that if the reaction inside the cells is really inefficient, so very small, particularly compared to the leakage rates, then you kind of have to run into both resources externally. So cell, resource one and resource two all have to kind of come together at the same time in order for this process to happen, for biomass to be built. And you might be more familiar with the Liebig's law. There's quite a lot of literature, particularly in oligotrophic environments of multiplicative co-limitation being used as a model for population dynamics, marine microbes particularly. But the interesting thing for me is that these two just pop out as limiting cases from this more general model. So that they're both in there. There's some interpolating form in between. And so if you like, it's a more principled way to derive both and where they come from. I'm not going to go into this now. We also generalize this model. And particularly, we ask what happens if multiple taxa interact via both consumption and production. So for example, in the gut, you're going to have some microbes which can use lactate as a substrate. And so then there's this potential for a positive interaction here. They also might compete for other resources. So both can be in play. This question here, does this change any of the insights that I stated earlier about stable communities? I would say I don't really have a clear answer to that. We derived a lot of interesting properties for what small systems of a couple of species can do, what outcomes we can see. But I would say, and this is an example of those equations becoming progressively more horrendous, I would say that those earlier statements, how they generalize, how robust they are to adding this underlying layer of mechanism is an open question. So I don't know the answers, but I am super interested in finding out. So basically, how to be stable if you have this internal metabolism taken account of. Does it help? Do you have a broader range of stable equilibria? Does it change other large-scale community properties, resilience, etc.? Those I think are interesting questions. I don't know the answers to them. So I'm just going to look at my time now. I realize I'm getting kind of late. I'll just give you a flavor of these last two projects. I'm more or less going to state what we did in them and then sum up. So with Rafael D'Andrea, and Theo Gibbs, who I mentioned earlier, working on the more general consumption processes, we generalized this picture to allow for stochastic processes. So instead of ODEs, we have a bunch of transition rates, resources increasing if there's flow in, mortality, uptake, depletion, all of that, but transitions between different states. We focused on cases where you would find a stable equilibrium if you were looking at the deterministic model. So we're not so much thinking about the unstable cases I've been focusing on in the other projects. But there's a really interesting set of questions. So here you might say, okay, it's stable, it's kind of boring, right? That's it, we know everything about it. But in the stochastic models, there are now other timescales which you can compare with the timescale to return to equilibrium, to a stable equilibrium. And so in particular, we asked what happens when these timescales cross and the timescales associated with stochastic drift become comparable to the return times to equilibrium. And our hypothesis was that at that point, you'll see neutral-like phenomena, even though this is still a non-neutral system. I'll skip through the details of that, but the punchline is we provided pretty good evidence that there is a transition from neutral-like behavior to non-neutral behavior at a, if you like, a finite degree of non-neutrality. Last thing I'll talk about links a little bit with generalizations that people have used Lotka-Volterra and stability criteria to gain insight into. I mentioned financial systems, other kinds of social complex systems. There's a lot of, if you look at who cited Bob May, there's a lot of work out there in many different fields. And so it really gave interesting insights into these different domains. But I also began wondering if in some of these social systems, there could be scope for understanding resource exchange with this additional degree of mechanism included, just like we had done with the purely biological systems, if you like. And I was inspired by some colleagues, former colleagues at SFI and elsewhere, who work on reconstructing the potential for agricultural productivity and ancestral societies. And so one way to mitigate the potential for a bad crop year in a marginal environment is to pool resources, to pool risk across multiple locations via food exchange. So again, I'm not going to have time to go into it, but feel free to ask me questions if you'd like after I finish. But I built a model to describe this, thought about the potential for exchange, both to mitigate that risk of a variable environment and also the potential for exchange to introduce instabilities, population instabilities, just as in those early models. There's also a really interesting link here with classic models in macroeconomics, where you would have a market system and price dynamics. There, your focus would be sort of on the first of these, maybe the resource dynamics, but not always, and the price dynamics. But it's sort of unusual in that context to include the population dynamics as well. But clearly, if you're talking about food, it's literally a life and death resource that the population dynamics can have a big influence. And in fact, the population dynamics coupled with the resource dynamics is critical to see these instabilities. Last thing, working with Jeremy Van Cleve, another old colleague from the Santa Fe Institute, thinking about the evolution of these strategies over time. So if you start off with a system either of biological species or human settlements exchanging or not exchanging resources, well, how does that exchange evolve over time? Where do they end up? How much do they exchange when they reach an evolutionary equilibrium? And how does that evolutionary equilibrium and approach to it interact with the population stability I've described? Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up. Say a couple of themes. I guess I picked out 4 things. All of these would be fun to talk about if anyone has any questions. So one is, I'm just going to state it, that how deep you go into the mechanism describing species interactions in this case, it can change some basic properties or intuition you have about community outcomes, something as basic as stability. Second question relates to Mario's project, and that is, how deep should we go into mechanism? How deep do we need to go? Will our conclusions keep changing, or will they be robust as we go further in? Say if we make that intracellular set of dynamics itself much more realistic what will change at the community level. So I suppose it's a question of how do those smaller scale mechanisms, what aspects of them feed up to larger scales? And also, is there a limited set of outcomes? I mean, I described two limits of the model with Mario. In some sense, those sort of dominate the possible outcomes. Certainly they dominate what we, how we model those kind of communities, Liebig's law and multiplicative co-limitation. So I guess I'm thinking about this in two ways. As we go deeper into mechanism, does it change the results? Does it make things more contingent as we add more in? Or can it serve to canalize some of the outcomes, limit them? Stochasticity and the depth of description can interact in interesting ways. And it sort of brings you into the domain of non-equilibrium phase transitions, which if anyone here is from a physics background, you'll have seen it's kind of a menagerie compared to equilibrium phase transition theory. But I feel like there's a small corner or an interesting corner of that realm of non-equilibrium phase transitions, which could bring together the kind of depth of multiple layers of description and processes that ecology has with stochasticity. Maybe there's more general outcomes of what we already found for this niche neutral kind of transition. And also this last project, super interesting. How's the evolution of these networks over time? The parameters themselves changing, the strength of interactions between the component parts. How does that interact with the ecology, the population dynamics and stability along the way? Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much, James, for the talk. Now, let's open the floor for questions. As usual, in the participant list, please raise your hand and I will call on you. So yes, Nadav, please go ahead.
Okay, just a little question, James.
Yes.
First of all, thanks for the great talk. And I was wondering while hearing this lecture, what is exactly the question? Because you were speaking about stability, and in my mind, at least, stability is as opposed to losing species to extinction. But when you show the graph that deals with the transition from high level of resource to low level of resource, it appears that losing stability means losing an attractive fixed point to a limit cycle. Now, a limit cycle is not a fixed point; it's not a stable equilibrium. But it also, in terms of coexistence, the species are still there. So in your eyes, what is the important question here? The stability as a fixed point or stability as avoiding extinction?
Yeah, I think the persistence of species avoiding extinction is the more interesting question. Obviously, when we started this, a potential outcome of unstable equilibrium might be that some species are driven deterministically to zero, right? So that was a potential outcome of the instabilities might have been the lack of persistence in some species. As you're saying, and well, as I pointed out, and as you're reflecting on, in the end, it does look like you get limit cycles. So everyone is there persisting. On the other hand, so I basically agree with you that the persistence of species versus not is the more interesting question. But those limit cycles, and I don't know the rules that govern this because I wouldn't say I know much about what those limit cycles look like, but it would be an interesting thing to dig into more. It certainly numerically does, it seems very hard to avoid those limit cycles being driven down to quite low abundances. Now, that's true if you look at Locker-Volterra predator prey or something like this, and it can be modulated by other terms that you might introduce which avoid that. But in these cases, I don't know if that's true. So in any case, for these models, those limit cycles can dip very close to zero, in which case, in a real system, if you have some stochastic processes that take place at low abundances, they amount to the same thing. You would lose species. Now, what would actually happen, suppose I did remove species from that numerical simulation as soon as they went below a threshold abundance, or I simulated the stochastic version of that model, I don't know what exactly would be the outcome in terms, presumably you may end up with fewer species, either exploring limit cycles which don't go close to zero, possible, or maybe you end up with a stable fixed point. But yeah, so I think I agree with your point. I don't think that you can entirely disentangle the appearance of the limit cycles from the question of whether species will persist versus go extinct.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Now I'm in trouble. I see there are 4 people with their hands raised, and I did not see who raised it first, so I will just call on them in order. So Chris.
Hey, Chris.
All right, thanks. Hey, James, great talk. So on the first part, when you're looking at the stability, it seems like another constraint that you might want to involve would be due to conservation of mass or conservation of energy. So I was wondering if you include something like that, and if you do, does it have a stabilizing force or not?
Well, let me answer the question, but maybe I'll give you a chance to respond if I'm not understanding it in the right way. So I designed, when Stacey and I were developing the first models, the ones I showed you the explicit equations for, they are designed to conserve biomass in this, or mass. The one caveat there would be, so the consumption process I allowed for this, there's still a parameter epsilon in there, which you could call efficiency. So I guess that's a loophole. But if I set that parameter to 1, then both the consumption and the production processes are designed so they balance across the 2 ODEs. So those 2 processes, modulo whether epsilon is 1 or less than 1, do conserve mass. There is inflow from outside and there is outflow. So those obviously don't. So maybe I'll let you tell me if I missed the point of the question, but is that something different from what you're thinking? That sense of conservation of mass?
That's probably answers that. I'll have to study up your paper again. What I was imagining was a scenario where there's, a resource that like I excrete, and then use it to excrete 2 of what I need, and then I use that to excrete 4 of what you need, and so on. So there's kind of perpetual motion machine.
Yeah. So that I didn't really go into any detail on it, but I have a former colleague now, moved to University of Chicago, but who works on closed ecological systems in his lab, and so we got talking quite a bit about, and we're still working on models related to those. So these are close to material resources, so light can enter. So that does change things, because you certainly don't have that material resource inflow. Light is going to modulate these processes, right? Consumption and growth rates for anything photosynthetic. There's an interesting set of criteria for stability in the perpetual motion version of this. And it doesn't have to be as absurd sounding as perpetual motion. For example, if you make the, so I would imagine it's particularly in a lab system, whether the biosphere as a whole is like this is another question, but in a lab system, there are always going to be resources excreted that no one who happens to be present, no taxa in that system, can actually use. So I think there's always going to be some terminal resources that are wasted, whether that may be less true in the biosphere as a whole, I don't know. So there'll always be something wasted, but if that's small enough, then you have an interesting set of models to analyze, which are in effect this sort of closed system going round and round, and there are interesting stability criteria related primarily to the initial amounts of, well, not the initial amounts, but I'd have to check what the results we got to are, but it's the ratio of biomass to resource mass that is important in determining stability in that situation. It's kind of interesting.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Rafa?
Hi, thanks, Yuri. Hi, James.
Hey.
So I'm going to ask a question. It's probably going to be a meandering question. So one of the points you made at the end was that how deep we get into mechanism might change fundamental outcomes of the model, like stability or not. And one of the results you mentioned was that when you had the inflow of resources, the first model you showed, the one you worked on with Stacey, reducing resource inflow destabilized previously stable system, right? So I was thinking, like, when we teach students about predator-prey cycling, one of the things we talk about is the paradox of enrichment, right? Where the opposite happens. When you increase the carrying capacity of the resource, you may end up transitioning from a stable to a stable point to a limit cycle type of equilibrium.
Yeah.
So basically the exact opposite outcome. But of course, there are differences there, like the resource in this case is biotic, there's a carrying capacity, the response function, the functional response to the predator, saturates, etc. But in your model with different assumptions, you got opposite results. But then, so I'm thinking, wow, making slightly different assumptions, we can get completely different outcomes. So the thing is to measure which assumption is correct. But it also turns out that measuring things like functional response is not that easy. To tell them apart is not that easy. So what do you think is the way out of this?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I'll make it more complicated first before which is just to give myself a chance to think about how to find a way out of it. But one of the reviewers it was actually, I think, in the paper on human food exchange. So I don't know if that would be anyone here, but thank you for the comment if it was you, suggested generalizing those models in a particular way. And in that generalization, you actually ended up with keeping everything else equal, just changing resource inflow rates. You ended up with stability at low resource inflow rates, instability at intermediate resource inflow rates, and then stability again at high resource inflow rates. So that's an even more complex, or an outcome which you need even more intuition, I guess, to interpret, put it that way. So yeah, how do you actually determine what's the right picture? That I don't know. I don't really have a good answer to that. At the moment in this set of projects, I feel like I'm at the digging or the mining stage to try and dig out what the landscape can look like, in terms of the project with Mario, the project with you and Theo, kind of assessing what can happen. And I suppose I'm hoping at some point the outcomes become limited in some sense, by that addition of mechanisms, but I don't think it's guaranteed. So I think it's not, I will say that I think there just in reflecting on this work in the last couple of years, there is an advantage in modeling these complex interactions in terms of the resources that mediate them. And I think there's additional complications, many more things to specify. That's what I've been getting at. But it's really hard for me to see with Lotka-Volterra equations how you can translate them to another context with a different resource landscape. So if you're thinking about gut microbiome dynamics, the resources flowing in to that community are going to determine, along with other things too, some of the interactions and the dynamics of that community. Change the resources flowing in, it seems inevitable to me that you're going to change not just the growth rates, but also the interactions. And so I feel like you can't avoid, for many questions, the introduction of that layer of complexity, or that level of description. But then, yeah, it does. Concomitant with that is a lot of choices to make. I'm mining out the landscape of those choices, or trying to, and I'm hoping that things narrow down at some point. So more of a hope than a response. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Zach, let's go Zach, and then Axel, and then Abdel. Okay, so Zach, go ahead.
Thanks, Kiri, and thanks, James, for the talk. Sorry if I just missed this in the talk, but I'm curious in the sort of consumer resource project with Stacy Butler, that work. You talked about, for example, like the architecture of a network and whether it's stable, like permits stability or not.
Yeah.
And so in those models, like I would think that the kind of architecture of the network depends on both the sort of matrix of preferences for resources and the sort of recycling exchange matrix. So did I just, in that case, are you just kind of thinking that all the action is in the recycling, or is there some kind of effective interaction network that like combines both of the two in a sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. You didn't miss anything. I just omitted important things there that are, but which would have taken some time to get into. And so yes, both come into play. Here's the closest I got to in the talk. I said something like reciprocity here means I give as much to you of what you need as you give to me of what I need. And so that was my subtle way of alluding to that yes, there's an effective strength of exchange. So in that second paper with Stacy, we came up with a measure of that, which does combine both the consumption. Well, we have a more general model where there can be both preferences and needs for multiple resources, similar to that multiplicative co-limitation I talked about in the other project. But yeah, the effective strength of interaction depends on both. We thought it was quite an intuitive measure of that effective strength. So, you know, that it's not purely down to the P matrix anymore. It definitely depends on the consumption requirements as well. So if I'm giving you something that you don't care about, that doesn't count, if you like, towards that measure. But what was interesting, this is sort of what I was getting at when I said we even though we're making assumptions, we feel like we push some of these results to be fairly broadly applicable. We still get something which is interpretable as reciprocal exchange, as a guarantee of stability. Because that was kind of neat, because you can simplify these models so that it does reduce down to just the matrix P. That happens in one of the cases I showed, where the consumption preferences are just a diagonal matrix. So you only eat one thing and no one else overlaps with it. In that case, the reciprocity is just defined by P, because then literally, you know, P12 and P21 are measures of how much I'm giving to you of what you need, because you literally only need and can use one thing, and same for me. So it's neat that what we first found for that simplified case does generalize. So that's a great question. Yeah, if you dig into that second paper with Stacy, it has this measure of that effective interaction strength. It would be kind of interesting to think about whether it could be generalized further. But yeah, that's in there, and it's accounted for when I say that reciprocity is still one of the criteria that guarantees stability. Great question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Axel.
Thank you very much, Nadav. James. I wanted to pick up what Nadav had asked, so I have to thank him too. I looked briefly at the paper, and there it says in the figure caption that you fix the abundances, or you sample the abundances, all positive, or at the concentrations, and then you constructed the other parameters to get a positive fixed point, somehow at random. And
Yeah.
if you do this, of course, you have coexistence up to instability of this fixed.
Yeah, right.
But then if you hadn't done this, if you had just constructed a random networks, would then maybe your answer to Nadav have been different?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, I think I'm going to take an easy way. I say, yes, the answer could have been different, and there could be some interesting phenomena, but let me just expand a bit on what I think you're getting at, what we could see. So let's suppose you take a situation where you know, positive interactions may, if you like, resurrect a species that would not have been there purely arising from the consumption and growth processes. So that would be an example of where I maybe choose parameters so that, you know, maybe I'm not getting enough. Suppose I specialize on a single resource, there's not enough of it coming in to balance my mortality rate, that kind of case, right? That would be a specific example of what you're suggesting, where I don't guarantee positive abundances. Yeah, that's a good, so then in that case, the positive interactions could resurrect that species, right? If somebody else is providing additional abundances, additional resources that I need. So that's for sure true. What would change about the stability criteria? That's a good question. I don't have a clear answer on that at all, but it's a good question. So basically, suppose you start with a situation where the equilibrium abundances would not all have been positive. Maybe you add in exchange such that they all become positive. Let's just say that as a stipulation. Do the criteria change? Yeah, they may do. Yeah, I think that's a good question. And of course, now contained within that are the possible outcome of not just limit cycles as you change the resource inflows. I'm sure in that case, you'll get some species being sent deterministically to zero. So definitely that part of the answer to Nadav would change. You could certainly get extinctions as you change resource inflow rates. But yeah, I don't know about stability. It's a good question.
That's important how this is coupled, right? How coexistence and stability and feasibility and stability are linked. Yeah.
Yes, sure. No, I think it's an interesting question. There's a whole other aspect here which I didn't talk about, which would be, you know, structural stability, if you like, or other measures of resilience of a system. And so something I talked a bit more about in the human food exchange paper than the other papers was that even if you're not in the situation we were just talking about, everyone has a positive abundance, you can still be vulnerable to environmental fluctuations, right? Like, you know, the rho I in these models changing over time. So fixed rho I, you know, the outcome is whatever it is. But if rho I itself is being drawn from a distribution, which it likely will be in any realistic system, so you have environmental stochasticity of some kind, then exchange can mitigate that. So it can confer a degree of resilience, if you like, because you're pooling that risk. You know, it depends on the resource needs and the exchange structure, while also potentially changing stability. So I suppose that I'm just saying there are, the way these, structural stability, local stability, these things interact is interesting. I don't have a better answer to your specific question though than that.
No, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdel.
Hi. So I was just wondering, to what degree do you think evolution will, or adaptive behavior will control the properties that you see for a stable matrix? Like, do you think if you add evolutionary or adaptive behavior, you will be guaranteed to see these properties, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just taking a step back, there's many really interesting papers, again, going across decades, honestly, of different flavors of this, but in the Lotka-Volterra models, so you have this, if you like, this problem, or at least question of how could you see strongly interacting diverse systems in nature, right? If they're supposed to be unstable. So then you could ask the question, well, if I evolve a community over time, or if I go the other way and start with a huge pool of species and let them get filtered out, I could, and in fact, depending on the rules you choose for those processes, you can end up with strongly interacting diverse communities. They just have very atypical network structures for a random draw, right? So imagine you start with a Lotka-Volterra system with the community matrix just being diagonal, and then you start to have some rules by which the off diagonal components change over time. And that, if you like, the subtlety is in the details of what are appropriate rules for that. That's a huge question, right? Because you might say, well, interactions are going to change because there'll be small changes, mutations, which lead to small mutations in the species traits, so small changes in interactions. But of course, many of those can be correlated. So if I change a trait, my interactions with many different taxa may change in a correlated way at the same time. So it's not just a question of saying you expect small changes in the community matrix which build up over time. I think it's a more subtle question than that. But certainly, if you allow community matrix to evolve by some sets of rules, you'll end up with a stable, strongly interacting, diverse community. So now that's the background. You are, I think, asking more specifically about these consumer resource producer type models, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think there you could definitely ask the same question, and I do think that they will. It depends on what you okay. So let's suppose you have your C and P matrices in that simplest model that I showed explicitly, and those themselves can evolve over time, right? So that will be adaptation of that community. So a couple of interesting things about that. One is I find it easier to interpret the evolution of those kinds of matrices than I would the evolution of a Lotka-Volterra community matrix. And that's because, whether I can consume a resource, you can kind of relate that directly to, do I have the metabolic pathway to break a particular bond, or perform the process I need to use this substrate, right? That's sort of clearer connection between phenotype and entries in C and P than it is for the Lotka-Volterra interactions, which sort of summarize a lot of stuff, which is hard to get at. So you could imagine, I think, and not with too much of a stretch, generate reasonable rules for those matrices to change over time. Of course, you'd have to end up with some kind of constraints to that process, because if I just say, I'm going to be really great at eating everything, obviously I'll just exclude everyone else, right? So that sort of, you have to think about how there must be some trade-offs, perhaps. But yeah, I don't know for sure the answer to your question, but I think given a model like that, it's not implausible that they may end up close to one of these special stabilizing matrices. In the one project where I could say more than just random speculation about that would be the project with Jeremy Van Cleve, which is still, it's in the works, so it's not even a preprint, but it's thinking about how networks of food exchange could evolve over time and the Nash equilibria of those processes. And then at least one of the Nash equilibria is identical to one of these special stabilizing matrices. Not guaranteed though. So interestingly, yeah, it again depends on the rules of that process. So if you delve into the literature on cooperation, there's sort of various, so suppose I change what I'm giving to you. You're going to respond to that, right, in some way. But that could be direct response, whereas you give me more or less based on what I do for you. But there's also indirect reciprocity. So you might see me giving something to Chris, and you're like, James is a nice person. I'm going to give something to him, and so that indirect reciprocity has been proposed as a mechanism by which we end up with these fairly diffuse networks of cooperation in human societies. That process could be at odds with the stabilizing network structures I mentioned. So maybe I should revise my question. I think it's possible that in some cases, adaptation of these matrices over time could lead you to the same network structures that confer population stability, but it may depend on the rules of that adaptation process. And I think, I have in mind at least one case where it's not guaranteed. So that's sort of what I meant by the interaction actually at the very end there, that there could be an interesting interaction between what's evolutionarily stable, but maybe you have to pass through a situation where the population dynamics are unstable in the middle, and that may change the evolutionary process. So yeah, it's a great question. Those are a few threads of answer. I know they're not really definitive, but it's definitely something that we are thinking about and trying to come up with at least some footholds into.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chaitra, and my sincere apologies for butchering the name.
Yeah, first of all,
Hi there.
thank you for the talk. Hi. I think you kind of answered at least part of my question when you were answering Axel's question, I think. So it was related to how, in the stochastic version of your deterministic resource consumer models, I think, you have considered stochasticity in the resource dynamics and then in the how the number fluctuates. But I guess if you incorporated stochasticity into the inflow rates themselves, that would probably change the stability criteria also, right? And I guess you were just talking about this with Abdel. It would also probably change how the response of the system. There would be adaptation to the changing inflow rates.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, we actually did include in that paper, that's a paper with Raphael, who asked me a question earlier, and Theo Gibbs, we did include the inflow process as being stochastic. So there's a process by which the number of molecules or whatever units you choose of I, the resource I, changes, goes up by one through the inflow. But there could be quite a bit of mileage in getting deeper into your question, which is, whether we fully explored I know we didn't fully explore the implications of that stochasticity in the inflow rate, but it is in there in the model. So the whole thing is stochastic. But one reason we didn't fully explore it is that in that PLOS Comp Bio paper, it's purely a consumer resource interaction. There's no production of resources. So if you like the interesting stability results, well, there are some interesting results for when you have this lack of proportionality between depletion of resources and the benefits. So if I mess up somebody else's resource pool, that's a separate question. But if resources are depleted by the same benefit I get from them, then the deterministic model would have a stable equilibrium, which versions of that proof go back a long way, actually, to the 80s, I think. So we took that case for the stochastic model, if you like, the simplest version, where everything is quite nice deterministically.
Right.
And we made all of that stochastic. Still got these kind of interesting results about the interaction of the timescales of the drift versus the basically the timescales associated with the linearized system. And so that was the main focus of that paper. But now, for sure, if we were to combine both things together, suppose we add the production process, make that stochastic, like you say, the inflow process should be stochastic. Yeah, could be some, I don't know. You know, sometimes with a stochastic model, of course, you get more or less the same as the deterministic model, but with twiddles on it, right? Things wiggling around a bit. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get something quite different. So I'm not going to, if it's okay, commit to answer of what I think would happen in that case. But I will say that it's certainly, yeah, something I have in mind to explore further, because why not, right? These models are interesting deterministically. It'd be interesting to see what changes stochastically. So it's probably a partial answer to your question. But yeah, the row part is stochastic. We probably don't have enough in the model to really push that and see what difference it makes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aithra and James. And are there any final questions, perhaps?
Thanks, everyone, also for the comments I'm just seeing in the chat as well. Appreciate that.
So if there are no more questions, then thank you so much, James, again, for this very interesting talk. I just want to announce that 2 weeks from now, brace yourselves, it's going to be our very own Geza Messina giving the IITE seminar. So see you there, same time, same place otherwise, and thank you all for your attention.